Welcome back to the second course stream of this week. Well, we had a lot of meanwhiles this week, right? So let's continue. While Lin Zexu is publicly destroying $150 million worth of opium, William Jardine hurries back to England, and his and Charles Eliot's plan was to force compensation from China through open warfare. For his plan to succeed, however, he would have to sway the opinion of both the public and the British government. And to be fair, public opinion was mostly against the war. People in Britain realized that this was highly unethical, highly immoral. However, as so often, because of successful lobbying, paying bribes, making promises, pulling the strings, there was a vote in Parliament, and by a very narrow margin, less than 10 votes, Parliament voted to go to war with China to seek compensation for the losses incurred by Lin Zexu's action. And the rest is history. I'm sure you've all studied the First Opium War. There is a Second Opium War a little later. And the Opium War was really a turning point in Sino-Western relations and in many ways in world history. This is interesting because the Opium War was really a minor war in terms of warfare. Only about 500 English soldiers died and, well, 20,000 Chinese soldiers. That, of course, is a lot, but it's very little compared to, say, 20 million victims of the Taiping Rebellion, which was a terrible, terrible civil war that hit China in the middle of the 19th century. And, you know, the Opium War was not really felt by very many people. It was pretty much limited to the South. However, its geopolitical significance, its historical significance was enormous. So China was forced into global trade networks governed by capitalism and imperialism, and it was forced to enter these trade networks essentially on other countries' terms, especially Britain's terms. Now, China's defeat, actually pretty rapid defeat at the hands of the, superior British military technology and its subsequent decline as a world power that had dominated world trade and the East Asian world for centuries, negatively impacted China's image among Europeans, right? Remember that the Jesuits, of course, really had created an extremely positive and highly idealized image of China in Europe, in the West. Now, the Opium War lives on in Chinese public memory to this day, which is part of the reason why Lin Zexu is still on a stamp. So what happened once the war was over? Well, a treaty is signed, the Treaty of Nanjing. And one of the lines in the treaty said this, that the island of Hong Kong to be possessed in perpetuity by Her Britannic Majesty, her heirs and successors, to be governed by such laws and regulations as Her Majesty, the Queen of Great Britain, etc., shall see fit to direct. So the island of Hong Kong is ceded to Great Britain in perpetuity. It becomes part of Great Britain. In addition, Britain demands the opening of 5 so-called treaty ports, demands large indemnity payments, most favored nation clauses, and extraterritoriality for its citizens. Most favored nation clause basically means that whenever China signs a contract with another nation, those conditions also will translate to Great Britain. And extraterritoriality, of course, means that if a Brit commits a crime in China, he cannot be punished under the Chinese legal system, only under the British legal system. And a few years later, a couple of decades later, in 1858, importation of opium was legalized. Here you have the Treaty of Nanjing. Copies still survive. One is in the British Museum. One, of course, is in the Gugong, the National Palace Museum in Taipei. So I said that one of the clauses was the opening of ports for international trade. So initially it was just 5, and you can see it was pretty much here along the coast. And one of them was Shanghai, which was to become the most important. Now, the cessation of Hong Kong was not a big deal to the Chinese. In fact, appeasement policies that involved the cessation of territory is something that Chinese policymakers have always favored. It always happened usually, in the Western territories, along the Silk Road, Northern territories, when you had invading tribes. Let's give them a little bit of land if that's what they want. Because there was a confidence that these barbarian invaders would over time ultimately realize the superiority of Chinese culture and civilization and would just become Chinese. They would just adopt Chinese customs and language. They would be Sinicized. Or over time, their military strength would wane. And in 100 or 200 years, we would just take those territories back, right? So you always had a much more long-term vision, a vision that would ultimately try to avoid conflict, military conflict, if possible. So if the British wanted Hong Kong, let's give it to them. Either they become Chinese or we'll just get it back in a couple of 100 years. Think about it. Didn't even take a couple of 100 years. So why did the British want Hong Kong? Well, they obviously wanted a port close to Canton. They wanted a port that was typhoon safe and that was deep, so their ever bigger ships could moor there and could restock and could be repaired. And here is an interesting map, right? So this is part of the delta of the Pearl River, right? So the Pearl River is here, Canton would be up here, Macau would be somewhere off screen, and here is Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is actually a pretty small island. And very soon, people ran out of space. Look at this image, right? There isn't that much space. It's mostly mountainous. So very soon they ran out of space. And in 1898, the British went back to the negotiation table and said to the Chinese, we need some additional territory. And they leased what became known as the New Territories. And they signed a lease for 99 years. Which seemed like a long time when they signed that contract, right? Think about it. You sign a lease for your apartment for 99 years. Ooh, that is never going to end, that lease, right? But you can do the math. 1898, when is that lease going to expire? Of course, in the meantime, in those 99 years, Hong Kong became Hong Kong. Here you have a map of Hong Kong, just showing you the rail lines and the airport and all the little cities that cropped up all over the territory. Now, we always think of Hong Kong as the secession of Hong Kong being such a big deal. Actually, the far bigger deal was the opening of treaty ports. And I already said that Shanghai became the most important trading center, actually, for foreign merchants. In part because in the middle of Shanghai, there was a foreign concession area, which was essentially an extraterritorial space. It was almost, like a semi-colony. And a lot of foreigners, especially British and American, went to live there. And Shanghai soon becomes the most important financial center in East Asia and one of its biggest industrial centers. And if you travel to Shanghai today, you can still see a lot of those colonial buildings. Here's the building of the HSBC Bank and the customs building along the Bund, along the waterfront in Shanghai. How did the Chinese feel about all that? You might remember that poem that we read a couple of weeks ago, right? In response to Western paintings. Well, some Chinese person saw a painting of probably Queen Victoria at court. And this is what he writes. You've read it before, right? Water deities wildly dancing on frenzied wave. A beautiful palace, half real, half false. A devilish people, a devilish clan, showing off the treasures of their devilish country. A pair of breasts, half revealed, her crown and hair, an elaborate coiffure. The painter misunderstood the Chinese mind. We did not want that barbarian queen. But here she is. We can sense that the Opium Wars and the defeat will have resulted, at least in some quarters, to anger, maybe a sense of anxiety, and a kind of sense of proto-nationalism. But as we will see next week, it also led some intellectuals to probably question their own worldview and the realization that maybe China also needed to change because the world was changing. And here's that image again. Again, we don't know whether this is what he, the poet, was looking at, but maybe something like this. Now, Lin Zexu, that hero, right, who made it on a stamp, initially was not treated like a hero. On the contrary, he was made responsible for China's defeat by the British, and he was exiled to Xinjiang, to the western border regions along the Silk Road. However, today he is largely remembered as a hero, and here he is, a statue of him, where? Chinatown, New York. If you ever make it to Chinatown, New York, you have to promise me to visit the statue of Lin Zexu. Now, in the meantime, Canton, that trading city, just booms and booms by all that, through all that international trade. Here is a view, 1865. So this is after the First and the Second Opium Wars. And British trade and, other European nations' trade just increases more and more and more, especially fueled, of course, by all that revenue from the opium trade. Here is an etching of Charmian Island, which is where a lot of foreigners lived when they were in Canton. Remember, at first they hadn't been allowed to live in Canton. Of course, after the First Opium War, the British made that a condition too. Now, what happened to all those wonderful Sino-Western relations that had been established, in part because of the Jesuit presence? I think I told you that the Jesuits had even been asked to build some European-style buildings as part of the old summer palace, the Yuanmingyuan. Here you have another image of that, another etching. It's beautiful. Well, in the wake of the Second Opium War, the British and the French loot those palaces, burn them to the ground. The great French writer Victor Hugo expressed his dismay at how this fabled palace was devastated by two bandits, one called France and the other one England. So you see, these terrible crimes that were committed, it's not that everybody stood behind them, right? There was actually a lot of public outcry in Britain, in France. But just like today, when politicians and certain elites get something into the head, public opinion might easily be overruled, especially when a lot of money is involved. Now, the ruins of those European palaces can still be visited in China today. So if you make it to Beijing at some point, you might want to visit and you might want to recall what we discussed in this class of ours. But now, let me tell you our assignment for today, which is really fun. It is the year of 1839. You have heard that some trouble is brewing in China. You are a policy advisor to a British member of parliament and a China specialist. Based on your reading of Qianlong's letter, the first letter, and Lin Zexu's letter, the second letter, as well as any independent research you might want to conduct, and the knowledge gained in this class, please write a policy paper, at least 300 words, no more than 500 words, in which you sketch out China's position vis-à-vis the West, and Great Britain in particular. What are China's views on global trade and modern capitalism, on international relations and Britain's overseas interests? What are the main cultural differences? Are there misunderstandings? Can there be a compromise? Please provide at least 2 citations from each of the 2 letters. And then articulate your position on how Britain should react to Lin Zexu's actions against British merchants. You can take any political or economic standpoint you wish. You can be the devil's advocate, or you can stand on the moral high ground, or you can find some middle ground, as long as you explain your position clearly. Feel free to leave a post in response to a posting from one of your peers you do not agree with, but please keep it civil. This is, after all, the British Parliament. And one last thing before I let you go. Remember that pagoda in Kew Gardens that I mentioned last week? And I said it'll come up again, right? It was built in 1761 at the height of the chinoiserie in Europe, at the height of European admiration and idealization of China. Fast forward 100 years, another building is erected in Kew Gardens, the Palm House, a huge glass house where British plant hunters like Robert Fortune, a botanist, introduce around 215 new ornamental plants, flowers, mainly from China and Japan, to cultivate in the gardens of Britain and Australia and the US. Now, Robert Fortune was not only after beautiful flowers, he went to China to steal the Chinese tea plant, Camellia sinensis, which only grew in China. So the Chinese essentially had a monopoly on tea. And from China, he brings these tea samplings to India, where, on behalf of who? Well, the good old, well, not so good British East India Company started to grow tea. Because guess what? The East India Company was worried that Chinese, now that opium was legalized in China, would start to cultivate opium by themselves and thus cut into its revenue. So it was looking for a new commodity to grow in India. And what better commodity than tea, for which there existed a huge market back in Europe, in America, and increasingly in India itself. So Fortune played a huge role in the development of the tea industry in India and later in Kenya and Africa. And interestingly, he actually used mostly Chinese know-how. So he would hire specialists from China who would help him with the cultivation of these tea gardens. And tea, of course, is only one of those plants that was essentially stolen from China or, other places and then cultivated in the British colonies. Rubber is another one that was smuggled out of Brazil and ultimately cultivated in Malaysia. And I will leave you with this really interesting image of tea cultivation and its preparation in Assam. And you can see here are Indian tea farmers, but you can also see that a lot of the specialists who work on turning the leaves into tea are actually Chinese specialists. So here you have it, another example of globalization. See you next week.